So when I talk to moms and dads and pregnant people, everyone seems to think that the safest and best place to have your baby is in a hospital with a doctor. But the United States has some of the worst birth outcomes. Our C-section rate is well above the recommendation from the World Health Organization. 30% of mothers have been traumatized during their labor and birth experience. And for maternal mortality and infant morbidity, the United States literally has some of the worst rates out of all of the rest of the developed countries.
Roughly 90% of births occur with a doctor at a hospital, so it's clear based on these rates that the hospital isn't doing a great job at producing good birth outcomes for low-risk, healthy women.
So after having 2 babies and becoming a doula and working in the field of birth, I've come to the conclusion that most people are grossly misinformed about birth and have no idea that if they are a low-risk, healthy person, the best place for them to birth their baby is at home with a midwife. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the history of midwifery, obstetrics, and childbirth in America. This will essentially be part 1 of a series of videos that is going to dismantle our collective cultural belief in the idea that all women should go to the hospital and have a doctor deliver their baby because that's the safest and best thing to do. Make sure that you subscribe so you know when the rest of the videos in
So
the
let's
series
take a look at the
out.
history of birth in America to understand why in one of the most wealthiest countries, birth is the most dangerous.
So midwives have been around literally since the beginning of human history. Women have always supported women, whether that be sisters and aunties or actual midwives who were recognized in the community as people who had wisdom about birth. In America, before the 1800s, the people who were attending and delivering babies were mostly Black slaves. And this was for several different reasons, one of which was because these slaves brought over a lot of ancestral wisdom and knowledge about birth. Another reason was at the time, birth was looked at as sort of a lowly occupation. For you to be a midwife, that was kind of a lowly, dirty job. In the 1700s, we start to begin to see a trickling in of male doctors into the birth scene, but they're mostly called in for emergencies that midwives can't handle. And I want to make a note to say that the reason why the midwife probably couldn't handle it is because she didn't have access to some of the more technologically, medically advanced equipment that would have given her the ability to handle the birth situation on her own. But by the late 1700s and early 1800s, a lot of European men were beginning to take birth very seriously and starting to look at it as an occupation. In the beginning, doctors were only called to emergencies, which seemed to be increasing due to urban civilization. Women who lived in the countryside and worked the fields and farms were robust and healthy. Their bodies were well equipped to bear children, lots of them. However, when cities developed during the Industrial Revolution, women who lived in squalid, filthy, crowded, disease-prone conditions were not healthy and developed rickets because of poor nutrition and insufficient sunshine. Under these circumstances, women whose pelvises were deformed ran into complications during childbirth. When midwives exhausted their means to help a woman give birth to an obstructed child, their only option was to call upon a surgeon who had tools to separate the fetal parts and extract the infant piecemeal. Gruesome as this seems, the only other alternative was excruciating death for the mother as well as her child. So to be clear, even at the very beginning, when doctors were being brought into birth, they were only being brought in these emergencies due to the cultural, environmental circumstances. It wasn't that there was something wrong with the midwives. It was that these women were being put in a situation where their health was suffering, and the midwives didn't have the technological advances to be able to deal with that. So now we can see there's a correlation between the big boom of industrialization and urban living with filthy living conditions, diseases like rickets that would have a heavy impact on how a woman's pelvis was formed and could possibly create some issues during birth. And then there was also a general fear of birth. But the more that doctors were called in to deal with these emergency situations, the more that the interest grew, and it was beginning to be looked at as something that could be lucrative. People could make a lot of money off of birth. And the more people who became interested, the more doctors became trained, and they eventually were able to band together and create organizations and licensure practices. At some point, they would even begin to create schools. This was something that the midwives had not and could not do because many of the midwives came from different parts of the world. This meant that the way that European men banded together to create organizations and rule was not the same way that midwives at the time could come together because they came from different parts of the world. They spoke different languages, had different cultural practices, and ultimately they had a lot less power than the European men at the time. In Europe, in the 18th and 19th centuries, and later in America, more and more individuals entered medical schools and specialized in obstetrics. To gain more clinical practice, they established lying-in hospitals or wards in major hospitals. So now that you're beginning to see there was an increase in the interest of birth and the idea that obstetrics could not just be a profession, but a profession that was for well-to-do people, a profession that was for dignified people. And as they began to band together and create these organizations and schools and different protocols, they were also able to work their way into already existing hospitals and create their own hospitals. And the most important part to note here is that they weren't just creating the hospitals to help women. They were creating the hospitals so that their students would have a place to learn. It's much easier to take all of the birthing people, put them in one place, and take all of the students and put them in one place, rather than pairing off a student with the teacher who has to then go to a home birth. And so now we're looking at the entire reason that birth got into the hospital was in part due to the fact that people had to learn, or people wanted to learn about birth. So doctors weren't really coming in benevolently. They weren't coming in to collaborate with midwifery. They were coming in to take it over, and it was quite honestly a lot of selfish moves made that I don't think they truly knew how negatively it would impact birth in the long run. A series of events between 1910 and 1920 set the stage for doctors to usurp the traditional role of the midwife and laid the foundation for a pathology-oriented medical model of childbirth in this country. Two reports on medical education, published in 1910 and 1912, concluded that America's obstetricians were poorly trained. To improve obstetrics training, one report recommended hospitalization for all deliveries and the gradual abolition of midwifery. Rather than consult with midwives, the report argued poor women should attend charity hospitals, which would serve as sites for training doctors. So at this same time, it was becoming more popular to have a doctor attend your birth versus a midwife. If you recall back to how I described to you how before doctors tried to take over midwifery, the main people who were doing the work of midwifery were either Black women, formerly Black slaves, or it was immigrant women, both of which were probably poor, both of which in the social hierarchical structure of that culture are literally at the bottom of the totem pole. So for rich, elite, well-to-do people, it was becoming more popular to bring a doctor into your home versus a poor immigrant or Black midwife. This began to set a standard for all people because, as we know today, the trendsetters in society are normally always the rich people, the people who are famous, the celebrities. And so in this time, the elite were the ones setting the standard. Now, the next question is, why were the rich and the elite making the decision to bring in a doctor? They assumed that well-trained doctors were better than midwives, and there was propaganda in place to back up this thinking. So at the time, in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, there were several different doctors, obstetricians who were coming out and speaking against midwifery with the plan to eliminate midwifery as a whole. They saw midwives as a threat to a growing industry that could make a lot of money. And so they had to kind of start this cultural conversation about how midwives are stupid and ignorant and have no place at your birth. Again, we already touched on this, but women began to believe that they'd rather have a white male attend their birth than a poor Black or immigrant woman. In my research, I found that the main person who was leading this abolition of midwifery was Joseph DeLee. He's actually noted as the father of obstetrics, so he had quite a bit of influence. He did aid in the advancement of technologies that would essentially help in childbirth, but it got to a point where it went overboard, and he began to look at birth as if it was only pathological. Perhaps laceration, prolapse, and all the evils are, in fact, natural to labor, and in fact, normal. If you adopt this view, I have no ground to stand on, but if you believe that a woman after delivery should be as healthy as well as anatomically perfect as she was before, and that the child should be undamaged, then you will have to agree with me that labor is pathogenic, because experience has proved such ideal results exceedingly rare. So what he's saying in this quote is basically that birth is pathological in nature. It is not normal. It is not going to be good for the mother and baby. Birth is something that damages the mother, damages the baby, and is ultimately dangerous in nature. And he believes this because he says that he rarely sees a normal, natural, physiological birth that doesn't damage the mother and baby. Now, again, we have to go back to the period of time that he was living in, where there was so much disease, literally disease running rampant. The sanitation, common sense that we have now, like washing your hands and sanitizing things, they didn't have back then. So disease was rampant. People were dying left and right. And of course, mothers were affected by this. Also living in a time where women were cooped up in tight houses, in tight living spaces. They weren't outside in the fresh air, moving, their bodies like in the countryside. So this also is going to impact the health of a pregnant person. So essentially, there's a point in time where women are becoming really unhealthy, and their chances of having a healthy birth is lowered because of the environment. But you have this doctor who's saying the reason why birth is bad is because birth is just bad. It's not, he doesn't even recognize that the environmental factors are having such a huge impact on birth. So in a response to all of the labors and births that he was seeing that were ending badly, he created a system called prophylactic forceps operation. Prophylactic forceps operation consisted of several steps: scopolamine injections in the first stage of labor, ether anesthesia in the next stage, then episiotomy and forceps delivery. He essentially wanted to drug all mothers so that they were not conscious during their labor and birth. He then wanted to use forceps to drag the baby out and then give an episiotomy so that the baby could come out more easily. And he wanted to do this to all women because he truly believed that birth was pathological in nature and that this was the only way to manage birth so that both the mother and the baby have a healthy outcome, which we now know is very far from the truth. Now, when he first introduced this concept to his colleagues, it did not catch on. His colleagues and peers actually felt like, okay, this might be too much. But that soon changed with the baby boom. And when there were so many pregnant people having so many babies, all of a sudden, doctors were looking for a way to streamline the process and standardize the process. So basically put women on a conveyor belt system and birth could be managed a lot easier. And this is when we see doctors starting to adopt Joseph DeLee's ideas about the prophylactic forceps operation. He said that if birth were properly viewed as a destructive pathology rather than as a normal function, the midwife would be impossible even of mention. So as we can see, Joseph DeLee was not only the father of obstetrics, but he was also leading the movement towards heavily medicalizing birth. He was leading the movement of the huge fear of birth. And he also had a lot to do with the cultural idea of needing to eliminate and not trust midwives. But what made his ideologies really click with the public had so much to do with painless childbirth, because a lot of people who, again, were affected with things like rickets and had these painful birth experiences, some women died, and birth just was very stressful. Women looked at the idea of painless birth as something that was amazing. So during the 1800s and 1900s, there were several forms of pain relief that came on the scene. These included, but were not limited to, scopolamine, chloroform, ethers, morphine, and what is commonly referred to as gas. But what was most popular in this time was something called twilight sleep. Now, this is when a mixture, a cocktail of drugs was given to a birthing person as soon as they came into the labor ward. And it didn't take the pain away, but it essentially got the person high. And also there was an amnesia effect. So when they woke up the next day or within the next few hours, they couldn't remember what happened to them. So it wasn't that they weren't feeling pain. It was just that they had literally no recollection of what happened to them while they were giving birth. It's so important to note that during this time, which was around the 1920s when twilight sleep was most popular, in order to control women from thrashing around from the pain of birth, they literally tied them down, tied down their arms, tied down their legs, because women were literally scratching at their eyes, scratching at their face, going crazy because they weren't consciously aware, but they were still technically feeling the pain of childbirth. And so at this point, this is when we begin to see the merge of the doctor, the obstetrician, and the total and complete submission of the body. And now we have a generation of doctors who are being bred in a system where it's normal to tie and strap down a woman, do whatever you want without any consent, and you get to walk away and not answer to anyone, and that was normal. So now when we look at obstetric violence today, it's all a part of the system. When you see doctors who were giving episiotomies without consent, it's just a part of the system that was already in place when obstetrics first began. So at this point, doctors were in a position where not only were they being more culturally accepted because of the propaganda against midwives, but they were also able to advertise their services not just as safer and better and for well-to-do elite people, but also to advertise the idea that they could give you a painless childbirth experience. And it's not a fact, it's an idea, because these women were in pain. They just couldn't remember that they were in pain. As I mentioned before, midwives have been around for all of human history, and the idea that birth has to be painful and scary has not always been a thing. So as I was researching, I kept trying to figure out, when did this fear of childbirth actually begin? In the book Childbirth Without Fear by Grantley Dick Reed, he explains how the more civilized people become with advancing technology, the more we lose our understanding of birth and begin to fear it. To add to that, this was also a time where Christianity was still teaching the idea that women are supposed to suffer through birth as a punishment for the original sin. And the church actually spoke out against midwives because they felt as though they were in some ways using witchcraft to help women have their babies and to take care of themselves. So at this point, fear of birth was at an all-time high. A lot of women were also immigrating into the United States at this point in the 1900s, so they were beginning to be disconnected from their cultural practices, where at home they might believe that birth is a normal function of the body, it's nothing to be afraid of, and yes, it might be uncomfortable, but it's not horrible, and it's somewhat of a rite of passage. In America, there was no cultural ideas that supported birth in this way. So there was a huge disconnect in the idea that birth was good. So to recap, there are several different timelines that all merged perfectly to produce the obstetrician and the type of hospital care that we use for birth today. First off, modern medicine was beginning to gain notoriety. Before the 1800s, modern medicine wasn't really a thing. It was far from what we see today as far as it being organized and established, having all these technological advances. So at the same time that modern medicine was growing, women were also facing lots of challenges in childbirth because of urban living conditions that were filthy and ridden with disease, in the absence of their cultural connection in order to really understand birth versus fear it. So although medical doctors were able to come in and help these women that were sick and diseased and were having complications in childbirth because of their environment, they ultimately took what they found in that one specific situation and applied it to all birth, which means they began to develop the ideology that we should standardize the medical model of birth rather than let normal physiological birth unfold in healthy, low-risk people. The other timeline happening was that medical doctors wanted to be able to tap into the lucrative business of birth because they will always have clientele and always have customers, and being an obstetrician began to become a dignified role in society. By the 1900s, lawmakers and doctors were making it very difficult for midwives to continue to practice. Now, although 95% of births were at home, only half were attended by midwives. And by 1930, that dropped to 15% and would continue to drop. While doctors and specifically obstetricians were able to band together and make organizations and rules about licensure and practicing, midwives often could not read or write because they were poor and immigrants, and so they could not band together in the same way, which meant they were eventually either totally outlawed in some states or banned in other states, or simply could not practice because they could not receive licensure because they couldn't read or write. At this point, midwives were reduced mainly to the poor women who needed them and couldn't afford hospital bills and going to the doctor. By 1925, midwives were coming back on the scene again, but it was only because doctors needed help dealing with the baby boom. At this point, they needed more hands on deck, and so they created the certified nurse midwife, which meant it was a midwife, but they were under the authority of an OB, and they had to be trained through the medical model. So it was far from what we would have seen a midwife be like back in the 1700s. And we should also note that these certified nurse midwives that were being grafted back into the medical system were, of course, white women, and rarely ever poor immigrant or black women. But even as midwives were beginning to be accepted again, they had to work under this medical paradigm, which meant midwifery looked a lot different than it would have been back in the 1700s. And it wouldn't be until the 70s when we began to see a resurgence of midwifery that really supported normal physiological birth. This was in part due to the fact that in the 70s, people were getting more in touch with their natural side and natural practices, and that was becoming more popular. People like Ina May Gaskin, who was a midwife, began to spearhead a movement to welcome home birth back into the state. I know some people have an issue with Ina May Gaskin, but I'm only mentioning her because she is a part of this history. It wouldn't be until the 1990s when certified professional midwives actually solidified themselves, created organizations, and started to put together clear rules and parameters around licensure. So to recap everything, the reason why most people think it's safest to be in a hospital with a doctor to have your baby is not because that's based on research and evidence, because it's not. We'll get into the evidence in the next video, but it has to do with the history of birth and how from the 1700s to the mid-1900s, most people had a fear of birth that grew out of the time period where things like urban civilization, disease, industrialism were having a huge impact on the health of women and their ability to have normal physiological low-risk births. This shift in ideology and historical amnesia has brought us to the point that we are today, where only 1% of birth is happening at home and only 8% of births are attended by a midwife. In the upcoming videos, we'll be talking about the statistics, the research, the evidence behind hospital-based practices, and if home birth could be a safer option for low-risk, healthy birthing people. If you want to know when those videos come out, make sure you hit that subscribe button and also click the bell so you get a notification straight to your phone. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know down in the comments what you gathered, what you think, and I'll see you next time. Peace.